Perfect. Great. So, data is incredibly critical for identifying gaps within communities, really measuring that impact, addressing how we're progressing on that impact. Um, it's a great way to address equity as well and evaluate truly how folks are doing as they're really looking to achieve that social impact piece across communities, right? And although there's a lot of reliance on data, there's oftentimes that hesitancy or reduction from communities, perhaps because may come across as performative, or it may come across as as a way um, of a form of tokenism, or trust was broken, and it's really hard to rebuild that. So folks are really trying to identify the purpose of the way the data is being collected in the communities. There's obviously a need for data for good, and that's very vital. However, the big question is, how do we rebuild that trust that's already been broken? How do we truly measure progress um, when it comes to community development and social impact in such a meaningful way? Um, and I guess the other side is like, what does good data mean? What does that even look like, right? So I'm really excited for today's conversation. So to really welcome Chris Belanger, who's the co-chair at Data for Good Ottawa, Erin Montague is a social impact evaluator, uh, Paluck Kholi, who works for Social Innovation Canada in impact measurement, client engagement, and communications specialist. And of course, Shakara Russell is the co-founder at Osenwell. Did I pronounce that correctly, Shakara? Osenwell? Perfect. All right, wonderful. Well, thanks so much for being here. And I want to kind of start this a little bit light and ask you perhaps what is the one thing that you want folks to take away or to implement after listening to our conversation today about using data for good. So perhaps Paluck, I can kind of start with you there. You're first on my screen.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks again, Samya, for having us today and sort of holding this very important conversation. I think one thing that one key takeaway from my end would be really sort of identifying what data is really important to be collected. Because a lot of times what happens is we tell social purpose organizations or individuals that this data is necessary to be collected. Maybe that's funder driven, or they will be told to do so, not even thinking where is it going or what's the end. So I think just identifying what's really necessary to move the needle. We really do not need all the data that's being collected. We really have to be sort of intentional with what needs to be collected.
That's a great takeaway for sure. Thanks, Paluck. Erin?
I have to say, I'm going to say something probably along the same lines, which is, just thinking about the way we manage and apply data in telling the story. From an evaluator perspective, we often are replicating and scaling on initiatives that are really impactful and are making differences, but there's rarely a one size fits all way of looking at measuring that impact. And so, considering the unique attributes of every impact story and how that can be reflected in the way that we're managing data, whether it's the way data is collected, analyzed, synthesized, or shared.
Thanks, Erin. Chris?
What I would suggest is, whenever we're approaching a project where the goal is data for good, is to always take a step back and ask, whose data are we talking about and whose good are we talking about? Data and good can sound very neutral and objective, but in practice, there are always assumptions and choices that are baked into them in any context whenever we actualize them. And that's okay. That's normal. And, in my view, that's unavoidable. We always have to make those choices in order to boil something down into data, but we should be aware of it. We should talk about it, and we should make sure that those assumptions and choices are appropriate for the current situation.
That's such a great point. Who does it benefit, right? Who's good? So that's a great reflective piece for sure. Shakara.
Yeah, I think, Chris, I really agree with that point, and that's probably where I will lead is, I always remind myself when we're looking at data and data collection exercises, there are people behind those statistics, numbers, stories, whatever we are collecting on it's the lives of individuals. And so when we look at data for good, I do like that. I'm going to echo what Chris said: data for whom, data collection on whom, data collection for what good. And then I would add, who's leading it? Who's at the center of that data collection process, and whose voices are being included and excluded from the way that we've chosen to, amass the data and then eventually use it.
Thank you. Those are some incredible takeaways for folks who are really looking to take a deep dive into data and social good. That kind of leads to my next question, to kind of allude to what Paluck had already highlighted in terms of we're missing that connectivity piece oftentimes when it comes to data collection, because there's a funding tied to it, or there's some form of I guess I don't want to say it, but a form of checking a box, right? And oftentimes like human connectivity. And to Shakara's point, we're missing that piece in identifying, data. There's someone behind it, right? So how can we use data for social good, right? And what does that need to look like? So Shakara, we ended with you. We'll start with you for this one.
Yeah, no problem. I am reminded of some of the work within community and how the data that we should be collecting should enhance the work that is being done in community. It should be the tool, because that's all it really is the tool that enhances what fantastic leaders are doing within the community to help them make more informed decisions. When I see social organizations, social purpose organizations surviving on, I would call what I'm going to call like a gut reaction to what they think is happening in the community, most times it's not off, but having that data be able to just help them advocate more for the resources they need, help them expand programming in areas that they see gaps in that they intuitively know. But now we've got actual, like, what is the right allocation of resources based on what the information we've gotten through our data survey provided us. I think data as a tool for good is great. I think it's how we actually, resources are limited. And so how do we allocate those resources in the most efficient way? Data is probably one of the most unique and appropriate tools for us to leverage. But I'm always like, the human-centric design of how data is collected and managed has to remain paramount.
Amazing. Thank you. Chris.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, so I'm kind of a huge techie, so my answer is maybe more directed sort of towards that crowd. But sometimes it's easy for people who work with technology to get distracted by technology itself as this shiny object, and there's always something new and it's always exciting. And when you want to use data for social good, though, I think the core is to make a positive material impact on people's lives. And so for those who are kind of really into the technology thing, I just want to underscore, I'm with you. But it's also important to make sure that you're connecting with the community that you're trying to help and understanding their perspective and working with them using the simplest technology that will get the job done. I was working on a project where someone was really excited to set up a cloud-based database to store this data, and they were really excited about data models and data schemas and stuff. But if the data was going to change once a year, it could just be saved as a file on your computer and emailed around. It doesn't, the barrier to entry is so much lower then. And so that, just to kind of circle back to focus on making the difference and to focus on connecting with the communities and delivering something that they need, as opposed to something that's like the shiniest new object.
A great point. Great point, Chris. Erin.
I think both of my colleagues have spoken really well to this question. When I looked at this question, I thought about it in kind of two ways. And trying to think about it from the community in terms of the community services sector. What can data do for you, and what makes good data? And so, the informing decision making, being able to communicate your difference and advocating is so important. The thought I had was around supporting adaptability and flexibility. I think at the beginning of COVID, what we saw a lot amongst our community partners, people who were working in social services across different types of spheres, homelessness, housing, mental health, working with children, working with those additional specific needs. We saw that those who were able to tap into their own data about their clientele, or who were able to look at their own results and findings from the last couple of years, but also at the immediacy of COVID, they were able to use that to be able to speak to funders, to change the way that programs were run, even if they were funded by others. But also be able to adapt and be flexible. And that's going to be so important moving forward, especially if we are heading into the recession that it looks like we're heading into. Adaptability and flexibility are going to be very important. And data is so important to be able to take a look at what's happening, look at your own organization, look at your own clientele, look at your beneficiaries, include them in the discussion, and then think about how can we grow, how can we modify, how can we change things to be able to meet the new need. One other little controversial thought around it is that collecting our own data protects us. There's a lot of data out there, there's a lot of statistics out there, there's a lot of fantastic tools that we have at a national or macro scale for statistics and quantitative as well as qualitative information that often can be misconstrued or framed incorrectly. And I think it's really important that when we think about using data for good and what makes good data, we think about what is the information that we can collect at a local level when we're doing kind of community impact, or when we're working in social services, to be able to add to that context, whether it's bringing our own knowledge to the conversation, or whether it's being able to say, I see that these statistics are out there. What that actually means is this. It's explaining the how and the why of why we're seeing what's going on and what is the progression that needs to move forward. So I think there's that element of being able to provide more context by being able to share your own knowledge, which is really backed by having data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative data.
Thanks, Erin. That's such a great point. And I think, thank you for also highlighting COVID-19 in terms of the way that data was being collected and data was not being collected. I think part of the concern was also for folks in the way to kind of, I guess, participate in the way the data is being collected, which was a huge, huge concern, because oftentimes the way that the surveys or however data is being collected are being designed are inaccessible to folks. So it's really unfortunate in the way that things happened. It's not something that's new. It certainly amplified the gap that was already there. But yeah, thanks for highlighting that. And we'll go over to you, Paluck.
Yeah, thank you. Also, really enjoying this conversation because such great points are coming from all the panelists. I think just want to add to that, again, as even Shakara had mentioned, how can we really humanize this whole process and not just treat it as numbers? So really sort of echoing that. In terms of how can we use this data for social good, I feel even through my own sort of experience working with social purpose organizations, I think empowering them has been the most beautiful part, where how can we empower them to be able to make the right decisions? How can we empower them with the right tools, which are not just data focused, but also humility focused? And I'm using humility instead of human sort of human centric also because, there are so many other aspects or context that we might disregard just by focusing on the human. Because again, we're all trying to focus on when it's data for social good, it could be, of course, people and also the planet. So yeah, just sort of just empowering them with tools, even as Erin mentioned around flexibility. So we work with the common approach to impact measurement, which also stands for, hey, let's meet them where they're at and let's empower them. Let's help them define their own metrics and their own levers for success.
Absolutely, thank you. And that's amazing. And it kind of also leads to, I guess, the next ask that I have, because with folks handling data, with handling data comes accountability. And there's been a huge call for that among organizations in the way that data is being collected, in the way that promises are made, in which things are not publicized. And so what is the accountability actually that needs to happen for folks who are behind it, who are fostering impact, for folks who are leading the projects when it comes to data collection? I mean, what does that accountability need to look like? Is it something where things need to be publicized in terms of, this is what we as an organization are looking, we're holding ourselves accountable, or what does that need to look like actually? So perhaps Chris, I can start with you on this.
Sure, yeah. So data accountability is a really interesting topic because it's so important. Obviously, it's the sort of thing where you just read the words and everybody, I hope, is going to nod and say, yes, this is ultimately important. And at the same time, what it's going to look like can, I think, vary quite a bit depending on the specific context, right? But certainly in the work that we do, data accountability is of the utmost importance. And I'll talk a bit about the organization Data for Good in a minute, so not to get ahead of myself there. But when we're looking for partners to work with, and when we're working with partners, the most important thing is ensuring that there is a common understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve, what data is going to be shared, what, if any, new data is going to be collected, who has ownership over it, what will be done with it, and just so that everyone understands what's happening and everyone is comfortable with it, and that you can establish that trust. And because in so many cases, the way that data is used these days, there is no accountability. Ultimately, that data is harvested about us at scale. Anytime we go online, and it's like you dip a canoe in the water, or a paddle in the water when you're canoeing, and you leave a trail behind you, and there are people vacuuming that up and doing things with it, and there's no accountability. And that kind of black box creates lack of trust and also some really unfortunate consequences. And so my view on this is that it's better to spend a lot more time on this up front, and to ensure that there is that constant dialogue as you go forward as well. So I feel like I could ramble about this for ages, but I'll keep it there.
Awesome, perfect. Thanks so much, Chris. So I'll go over to Paluck.
Again, sort of echoing Chris's points about ownership. And interestingly, the first time I actually came across data accountability, and it being, we living in this age where everything's monitored, even perhaps this conversation, my phone's probably listening to everything I'm saying in my opinions. It was scary, and I think it was Center for Humane Technology. I came across that organization and really got curious as to how can we counteract this, or how can we create more and more tech which is responsible. I think the framework that helps me is, again, this indigenous framework that I've been following a little bit. I'm also trying to take a course on, is the OCAP principles. I'm sure some of you may have heard of it. The indigenous principles, where who owns the data, who has access, who has control. And this was again led by indigenous communities, and really sort of being intentional about what is happening with that data, and who also has the P stands for possession. So I think that again sort of resonated in terms of how can we build more and more tech or data collecting methods that are responsible. I do feel again it's when we talk about community, it has to be, we have to be responsible there. We have to make sure there is full transparency, and as Chris mentioned, making sure that upfront there is a lot more time that is spent at this sort of juncture of being accountable. And really sort of giving the community the assurance that their data is safe, and what will be like the journey of that data.
Thanks so much, Paluck. And I know that there's oftentimes there are organizations that might lack capacity and they're dependent on other organizations in the way that the data is being harvested. However, what is kind of the line in terms of organization association when you're really trying to do good, but then you're also relying on another organization who's collecting that data, right? So that's very interesting to hear that. So Shakara, I'll go over to you, and then we'll go to Erin.
Yeah, at risk of being a little bit controversial, I'm actually a really strong supporter of data sovereignty. It's something that I've seen in the Indigenous community. I think that the ability to own and tell your own story is hyper important. And I don't care, there's no situation I've found so far that has changed my mind as to that the community needs to own the ability to be the first group to see their data. And I think there's benefits for metadata and sort of like big data, but I'm talking about even in some of the evaluation perspectives I have, it's you're collecting the data and it's already been informed on what you collect, how you collect it, how you package it. And as a community, you haven't even sat down and integrated what is in front of you before you're immediately asked to now process it and share it with someone else. And so I'm a strong supporter and advocate for the ability, if we truly want to have good data governance, it has to be led by the people who the data is about. Like, there's no way that I can tell someone who is unhoused, how to now move you through a process of housing you if I actually have taken your data, I've collected and say, well, this is actually what the stats have told me about what you look like. Right. And so I think, there is ways that partnerships can help, provide that context. I can't remember who actually said it and described it in that tone, but I like that idea that context in the collection and evaluation and description of data is so important. And if you haven't had the ability to have that as a lived experience, I'm not sure how you are able to provide that context deeply. So data sovereignty, data protectionism, it's a very hand-in-hand experience for me around how we talk about this idea of data accountability and data responsibility. Because if you can't revere the information that you've collected, if you can't protect it and hold space for it to evolve because it's not your first-hand experience, like, how can you actually be accountable to what you don't even know you should be accountable to? So that's sort of my thoughts. I know it's a little bit, it pushes a little bit on this idea that we as individuals can be wholly accountable. But I'm very sensitive to the fact that I can't be accountable for what I don't even understand that I need to be accountable for. So that's sort of my thoughts around the way that we can choose to observe and hold space for this data accountability. And it lives, I think, the workaround or the way that we can get past this is really around that partnership to understand, even at the design of data collection processes, if we're collecting on a certain community, how do we get the information or be informed by the way we design our data collection process, our methodologies? Are they informed by the people who this data is going to affect?
Yeah, so many great points there, Shakara. I think it's very important to highlight. I think this was alluded to before in terms of that cookie cutter solution. of the way that things are being done. So that's such a great point to be made. And Chris, did you? Yes, virtual hand up there.
Yes, class nerd raising my hand. Just so Shakara, just what you said resonates with me really deeply, and I just wanted to make a pitch, picking up on something that Erin said also earlier, for an expansive definition of data. That, you know, in these discussions, there's often an assumption that data is numbers. Data is stuff you can count. It's usually like natural numbers. Sometimes you do some division and you get a real number, you know, but it's mostly, it's usually counting something. And that's important, right? But there are a whole bundle of assumptions that go in there. What are you counting? How do you define those objects? You know, what are you not counting? But then there's also this whole other side of things, right? There's the qualitative side, the contextual side, and in these discussions, I don't think it's happening here, but in a lot of discussions, that gets often just completely ignored as not relevant, as anecdata or anecdotal, not anything. And I just want to put a little flag out that no, that stuff is super important, and that I think we should have an expansive definition of data that includes the human experience, and stuff that you can only get through stories. And it's harder because it's a lot of work to go out and do interviews or you know, collect written works or stories, and then it's a lot of work to process that, and you have to present it. It's hard to make a dashboard out of that kind of research, but it's really important because it provides the context, the skeleton that all these numbers are going to hang on. Sorry, that's a weird metaphor.
I really like that. I'm glad that you added it, because I do think that it's, you know, Erin talked about qualitative data, and qualitative data is always sort of, even when we collect qualitative data, it seems that we are quick to try to boil it down into some sort of quantitative space. So even when we say, oh yes, we appreciate that qualitative is important, we're like, okay, we've got the qualitative. Now let's see how many times this theme came up. Let's see how many versions or mention of this thing was. And so we're quick to bring it back into this idea of something we can measure and count and share with a stat. And there might be one small quote taken from the qualitative data to attach to it, but we're quick to bring it back to quantitative. And I'm glad that you just echoed that, you know, data and it's fulsome. There's so much that we can find in all of it, right? Like, I'm sure the Indigenous communities will talk about listening to the trees is data collection. And how does I, as a management researcher, how do I incorporate that in my everyday? How do I put that as a measurement and methodology tool that I'm going to use and have everybody be like, no, she's not crazy.
Yeah, no, that's such an excellent point made by everyone. I think there needs to be a holistic approach, and the way that we measure success, it's so dependent on the numbers, right? As kind of Chris put it. And so what is the story behind those numbers? How can we measure success in other ways, right? How can we welcome that? So which kind of, I want to kind of go back to Chris and really the floor is yours. I would love to hear more. I mean, I had a great opportunity to chat with you about the work that Data for Good Ottawa is doing, but I'd love to really raise awareness, more awareness, and how the purpose of it all, and how you folks are helping others. So
sure, and I'll try to keep it brief, and if you want to be off stage with the big hook to if I talk for too long, but yeah, so Data for Good is a national volunteer organization, so it's entirely volunteer based, and it has chapters across the country. And the goal of Data for Good is to bring together, we call them data do-gooders, you know, people who either work with data in their professional work, or sometimes, you know, students or people who want to learn about it as a hobby. So it's really open to all skill levels, people who are interested in working with data. And we partner with organizations, we're looking to partner with organizations within the community and work with them to develop projects that we can work together on for to help them achieve their missions. And so by virtue of that structure, you know, it lends itself to some kinds of projects more than other kinds of projects. But so we normally look for organizations where there is some data that they have and that they're comfortable sharing with a group of, kind of well-meaning anonymous strangers. So it does require building that trust up front. And Data for Good Ottawa existed for quite a few years before the pandemic. It went a little bit dormant during the pandemic, like a lot of people's lives got turned upside down. We're in a rebooting phase right now. We're starting things up again. So I will give a shameless plug, which is that if anyone is either interested, please, you can reach out to me or via our website, dataforgood.ca. And especially if anyone works with or is connected with any not-for-profit or charitable organizations in the Ottawa region who might be open to working on a project. This is my shameless plug, especially because we are, as I said, kind of reaching out, trying to rekindle those networks and those connections and build that trust. And so even if it's just anyone's interested in a cup of coffee and a chat, that would be great, because we have a lot of people who are kind of really excited to go out there. They've all got their keyboards and their mice and, just saying, let's go. So we're looking to build some projects that we can hopefully make a positive community impact. But I see you with the big hook, so I'll stop it there.
No big hook. Just in awe of the amazing work that's happening. And I just don't want to not forget that Paluck has a virtual hand up, so I'll just go over there for a second.
I wanted to add to Chris's plug that, because we're also working on a project with Data for Good Calgary, and super sort of stoked and impressed by the work that they do. We're still like at the onset of the project. They're helping us with that impact dashboard and working sort of responsibly and thoroughly with the data that we are of social purpose organizations on how can we aggregate the sustainable development goals. So just trying to brainstorm and being intentional around that. So yeah, shout out to Data for Good for helping us with that.
Awesome, thanks, Paluck. So we spoke about this a little bit in all of the conversations that we've had in terms about seeing the big picture, right? And that's where equitable data collection comes into play, and that's something that's been an ongoing concern. The way that things are being collected, in the way that the linkages have not been made. COVID-19 again certainly amplified tremendous gaps in the way that the disproportionate impact happened across communities. So the question is, how can it be achieved? What are kind of some of the first two kind of critical steps that need to be made or remade or unlearned, I guess I have to say, towards this path of collecting equitable data? So perhaps, Erin, if I can start with you, and we'll go over to Paluck.
Yeah, I want to touch on something that Shakara brought up around data sovereignty. I'm not going to reiterate because I think she put it so well. But there are a lot of tools that groups, including Christopher's group, Ottawa Neighborhood Study, have provided for local agencies that maybe don't want to have data sovereignty, but don't necessarily have the tools and resources to be able to harvest their own data, or to be able to really collect that data. There's tools that exist to be able to start pulling that information, the analysis and synthesis, obviously, working with a group like Data for Good or working with Social Innovation and others. It's, there's a lot of help there. I think the part that I reflect on is recognizing the biases that are inherent in research, in data, in pulling in gathering any information together, really. It's, we obviously are introducing AI and other technologies, but there is still that human error aspect. And with human error, there are subconscious and conscious biases that are sometimes almost impossible to avoid, sometimes based off of the design of a research project, or based off of the ethical review that needs to be in place, based off of the procedures and the processes that you need to go through to be able to even do a research project or collect the data. And it's just, I think, recognizing and not ignoring the potential for bias and the potential for your own biases within data collection, as well as analysis, as well as synthesis, as well as sharing. So I think there's a lot of ways to counter your own personal biases as a data collector or researcher. There's ways to counter any biases that come out of just the innate structure of developing a research project. And a lot of that does come to, working with the beneficiaries and the end users and the communities that are impacted by the data. A lot of that can come to having second and third reviews of it by individuals or by groups who are not part of the research team. A lot of that can also be even just acknowledging that biases do exist within any data set or any collection of data, and what that could mean in terms of impact. At one point, I was working with a student who, for their dissertation, was working on looking at vaping, impact of social media on vaping amongst youth. And because of certain obstacles, including the beginning of the pandemic, she was only able to collect data from private school students, which she was able to collect data that's phenomenal. But there's obviously very specific biases in terms of collecting from one specific socioeconomic household type of group of individuals. So she identified that in her research because she didn't have the ability to go and get more data. We were in a place where she didn't have the ethical review to go to public schools at the time, and she didn't have the ability to go to community centers or to go to local community groups because they all had disbanded during the beginning of the pandemic. So recognizing where there may be further research that could be done, recognizing how her work was influenced, that was really so important. I think the other piece, and I'm going to stop after this, but the other piece is recognizing how we place merit on different methods of data collection. And I say this because I know of a few groups where Indigenous groups and community-based groups that have applied for grants or who have looked to apply for an ethical review through government or academia and have not been successful or who have been denied approval to collect data because they don't meet specific research methods that are identified as quantitative research methods or even commonly academic qualitative research methods. One Indigenous association I've worked with in the past are actually working on their own development of their own ethical review because of the fact that they had to wait so long for Health Canada to be able to approve their Indigenous research methods that they were applying. And I think this, we think of this happening in the past, but it's still happening today. And I think we need to take into consideration, how do we recognize how data is collected, and in all of those steps in the data collection process, including ethical review procedures and even in grantship. I'm going to end there so I can, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, so many incredible points. And that just, I'm just going to leave it that was phenomenal. So thanks, Erin, for shedding kind of the concerns that are out there. And then there's that association piece. And then, I want to say big kudos, because there's this, it's just a small saying, but if things aren't evolving, you create new things, right? So, and that's part of the concern that's been happening in the way that grants or funding has been designed. And we talked about this earlier in terms of how do we measure success, or how does the funder measure success, right? Or so how do we evolve that and unlearn and redesign, right? So great pieces there. So Paluck, we'll go over to you, and Chris and Shakara, if there's anything you'd like to add, we can kind of go from there. So Paluck, I'll just leave it to you.
Yeah, I think when I read this question, I honestly took a pause because, wasn't sure that if there is a definition or, certain set things that we can say, okay, this is how we do equitable data collection. And echoing also what Erin said, that, really questioning our own inherent biases. And really sort of going with that intention of holding this brave space with the community, where we want to really sort of shed our uh, biases, shed our understanding, um, and really deeply listen. And I think the only thing that I could come up with for this one was just deeply listening to the community and really providing them that sort of brave space. Because we, again, if it's getting into that conversation with extraction, then again, we're sort of being a part of that whole ecosystem which we want to step away from. So we don't want to be, again. So yeah, I think that was the only thing that stood out for me, that how can we sort of go with the mindset of deep listening to the community. And really, I think somebody had mentioned about that partnership or ally mindset, where again, right now, also talking about data sovereignty, that it will be great if we have representation, if they speak of their lived experiences. But if not, how can we really sort of shed our identities and go in with that mindset? But really sort of, again, I think this group is again making me think hard about how do we unlearn the Western ways of even what data means, what data collection is, and really sort of being open to other ways of knowing and learning and unlearning too.
Thank you so much, Paluck. Such again, a great point. And that kind of also comes from, I guess, the type of ally folks want to be, right? And it's a term that's been thrown around everywhere, allyship. But what does it actually mean? Like, right? So what is that accountability piece as you as an ally? So just also want to kind of emphasize that, right? In terms of allyship, what is it? What does true allyship mean? So it's not performative, right? I think that's kind of goes back to folks' hesitancy as well in rebuilding relationships in communities, and we spoke about this a lot in our conversation. So oftentimes, because to kind of Paluck's point, that term extraction, it feels, my heart is so heavy hearing that term extraction, because that's what's been happening, right? Folks go in, get what they want. That's how it's being perceived. You get what you want and then you leave. What's going to happen, right? So how do we better engage communities? How do we hold ourselves responsible for the way that it's been done in the past, and be as transparent as we can, so that we can authentically rebuild relationships in communities? So I guess, Shakara, if I can start with you on this, that would be great.
Yeah, Erin literally spoke all of my love languages just now. She talked all about how difficult, I find some of my students as they're building research projects and coming up with community-based methodologies, really struggling through the review process, just because it's such a foreign way for data collection to happen. It's a foreign way for, it's a very involved and community-centered way to collect data, and so the review process is very challenging. So I'm really glad to hear that Indigenous communities are moving past sort of Western ways of reviewing, of getting to that ethics review, because it is sometimes really discouraging for students. When I heard this question, I really wanted to think through, okay, so what's the point of research? What is the point of collecting the data? And one of the thoughts that came up immediately was well, with some of these communities, data has in some instances been extremely punitive, right? It's you collect the data, we have the best of intentions, we are going to help, and then the use of it is completely in opposition to what the original research question was and what you were hoping to achieve through conducting the research. And so when I think of this idea of what we can do to move forward, I love the conversation about bias recognition and sort of allowing that deep listening to happen. But I'm also challenged about I'm going to ask the question, who is doing the research? Why are you doing the research? Is it your right to do the research? And can you hold all of what comes out of that research? You don't just get to say it's now in a journal and we're done, or it's satisfied my funding requirements and we're done, right? Like your research has, lasting implications for community. And so are we prepared as researchers to step into that like radical accountability about what we uncover and protect the people who live behind the data? And that's sort of where that's the ethical and the justice that feels like needs to be encouraged and brought forward when we collect data and we collect information on lived experiences. Because regardless of how we coin it or describe it, it is data on lived experiences. So, I mean, we might not get there in my lifetime, but I'm hopeful that is what, as we introduce technology, like, AI is teaching us that, yes, it lives on forever, right? The AIs are collecting, they're a mirror of what we have previously researched, previously reported on, whatever way we've done it, the AI is mirroring what we have put out there. And so it's the testament that like our data and the research experience will live on in perpetuity, unless someone figures out how to turn off the internet.
That's such a
Chris might know.
I can see Chris. Yeah, that's such a great point, Shakara. Thank you. So, Chris, I will go over to you.
Just to touch on that last point. So if I did know, I wouldn't tell. But just about the point. So it's a tiny bit of field, but thinking about bias in AIs and algorithms, which is something that Shakara and Erin both touched on as well, which I'll say is related because it's what we do with the data, right? After we collect the data, we often do some, assuming it's quantitative data, we often do some math with it. And run these things through algorithms, which is just a fancy way of saying some math, right? But and we use these to make decisions that have material impacts on people's lives, right? Like, do you get a loan or not? Are you prioritized? Like what kind of healthcare treatment do you get? Are you approved for your whatever? These things matter to people a lot. And I think among this group, it might go without saying, but just to say it anyway, that not only are there human choices that influence the data, there are human choices that like each algorithm is designed, right? People make choices about how to do this math to decide whether you qualify for a job or a loan, or like these things that people need to survive in our modern political economy. And that's there's often using these algorithms, they're often presented as a black box, which absolves humans of accountability for those decisions. Say, like, computer says no, right? It's not me. And I think we should resist that. That it's either a series of equations that someone, like a model basically, that someone made, and you should be able to probe that model and understand the assumptions and critique them and criticize them. Or it's one of these so-called large language models, which are as close probably as we'll ever get to an actual black box, because they're trained on terabytes of dubiously collected data from across the internet, dubious at best. And there is no way to get an explanation out of it. It is just a magic 8-ball. And I do see a trend towards more meaningful decisions with material impacts being made via these algorithms that can never possibly give you an explanation. And I also think we should resist that we don't need to turn these important decisions over to a giant, very expensive coin flip, that we can demand more, because that accountability, we talked about data accountability before, because then there's the danger that the technology can be used as an accountability shield, that whoever is actually responsible for making that decision can just deflect it off to the AI. And that's a recipe for a disaster. But sorry, so that was my I'm going to say that was an answer to the question. Just
Yeah, no, I think that that's such a wonderful point in terms of our reliance on tech, where to draw the line, what the boundaries are. And you're absolutely right, because it's such an easy answer and say, hey, it's not me, it's the tech. So you're going to blame the tech, right? So that's such a critical point to make as well. So thank you, and that was not rambling on, but that was a great point to be made. Um, Paluck, is there anything you'd like to add to this point? Okay.
Yeah, I think in terms of community sort of engagement as well, I think where I again echoing the room sentiment that going back to the purpose, why are we doing this again? Is this just checking the box? Or are we sort of moving something? Is this because it's a part of the program or project or people you're dealing with that, okay, we need to engage them? Or do we really sort of, are we really meeting them where they're at? Do we care about what they care about? So I think that is where we sort of are able to involve them the best and get engagement.
Great. Thank you so much, Paluck. And I'm also being mindful of our time here. This conversation has just been so phenomenal. I want to draw some attention on the way that we're understanding data, and we spoke about this here today. But there's oftentimes folks who perhaps lack understanding in the way to set the metrics. I don't like that term. Or perhaps a goal. See that's not any better, but that really kind of tells a community's true authentic story in terms of impact, in terms of where the gaps or the barriers lie, right? So what are perhaps some of the bumps and opportunities that would need to be addressed or assessed to really kind of overcome these missing gaps that happen way too often, and overcome some of these concepts or perspectives that are already embedded, right? So what could that look like in terms of setting up for doing social good, in terms of setting up, what my goal or what my mission or vision or values are for the work that we're doing. So let me see. Chris, I'll go with you. Get you started off with the work you folks are doing with Data for Good Ottawa.
It's such a big question, and it's one that I'll keep my answer short, because honestly I'm really interested to hear what everyone else has to say. I'll say that when I think about this kind of question, I just think about the many examples from history of people who in their own minds, they thought they were doing something helpful, and they did not. and and so it's something that I do think about a lot, and it's one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to everybody today. I think for what it's worth, I'll like where I am, I'll keep it again, just to keep it short, is to really try to listen more than anything, to really try to maintain humility, and to really try to figure out what it is that, if you're there to work with someone, not for them or on them or about them, but with someone, then to let them lead, and be kind of in the dance that you're doing, kind of follow them as best as you can. And toes get stepped on from time to time, but if that's what it's like when you're learning to dance. I hope that just if you're trying to be a good partner, that you can build that trust, and it'll work out in the end. But
Thanks, Chris. I'll go over to you, Paluck.
Yeah, I think definitely around involving the community we're looking at, when it comes to um, successes, but also making sure that we're not burdening them with our own set of goals. Really having that open learning and unlearning mindset. I do feel that community knows, they know the best about themselves, so they know the best. So really coming from that mindset where we have to meet them where they're at, and really sort of rooting the work and the progress in community-based metrics. Again, I think like I mentioned earlier, the flexibility is important, and I think I mentioned a little bit about our work earlier as well through common approach to impact measurement, that how can we sort of empower organizations to take inspiration from whatever's out there. There are sustainable development goals. We also have localized indicators and localized banks. Canada has done it. A lot of municipalities do it. So really, I think all of those are great places to seek inspiration. But again, I think organizations, communities know what's best for them. So helping them find their voice, helping them be the storytellers, and setting the narrative. So I think that is where the key lies for me, for sure.
Thanks so much, Paluck. Shakara, I'll go over to you.
Yeah, I think one of the best strategies I've seen work in communities with partnerships with folks outside of the community has been to really anchor the entire experience in a participatory action framework. Having the goals from the very beginning set and led as a group and community-led experience helps frame the research and the data collection in a way that they talk. This is African proverb that always talks about, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. That is essentially how I see data transparency and trust being rebuilt. Like, no one wants to be researched about or on. Everybody wants to feel as though this is actually going to have an impact in my community first. I'm going to see it as I walk the streets. I'm going to feel it as I participate with my community. And so having that design phase live as a deeply collaborative experience, and being willing to be patient, like in these communities, like fast is not going to get you excellence. It's going to get you something done. It's not going to get you that deep, nuanced program or finding that's going to change or revolutionize the way that this community can take its future. No, it's going to get you a great report that can sit on someone's shelf for the next 7 years until it's shredded. So there's my thoughts. I notice as this conversation is going on, I'm losing a little bit of my ability, because I do believe that like communities know they know what the problems are. They probably have the answers already. What they lack is this way to organize it so that it can be sustainable and scaled. And so through data collection and the partnership with outside organization, to me, that's the gift we give them. We give them the gift to see their ability to solve their issues and also help us solve collective issues, right? So like I would hope that when we look at sort of partnering within data collection, that it is not about the replication of what has been done before, but rather, how do we take the uniqueness and the unique skill that this group has to add to our collective sustainability. That's sort of the approach I see, is if you want this to be an equitable and participatory experience, realizing that knowledge and ways forward and pathways forward all live within each of us. So how do we be additive to the collective versus being like, I'm just gonna take this, put it over here and make it a part of something I'm building.
Yeah, no, great points there, Shakara. And I think we live in a world where we're looking for very quick solutions, where we're like, okay, let's collect the data, let's make this happen, and then we'll just get out and leave, right? But it's you're absolutely right in the sense that we need to be okay with progress at times, kind of take a step back, and reflect and go wherever it takes us, and not be so heavily relied on solution finding right away, but learning and listening, and allowing for ourselves to hold ourselves accountable for what we've done in the past, and allowing welcoming kind of authentic allyship as well. So thank you. And Erin, I'll go over to you.
I actually want to touch on something you just said. I love that idea of not going to solution oriented first, because sometimes we don't actually even know what the real problem is. So that's a really good point. I kind of see two sort of obstacles that I just really quickly want to touch on. One being there's sometimes consultation fatigue and research fatigue amongst community members. From my own experience, going into a community to do research on a national insurance, a new national healthcare insurance, and just community members being like, why are you here? We're tired of answering questions. We're tired of being part of these conversations, and we see no impact on us. So we don't see any direct benefit. We don't see any long-term benefit. So, stop coming to us. I think there's a couple of ways to, combat that. One being sharing the results with community members. Once you have them, sharing the reports, sharing the findings, maybe they'll actually have a solution that they can come out with, saying, like, you've got these results, thank you, like, why don't we see what we can do about this? Another idea being, looking and seeing what's already been done within a community or within a group of individuals, of end users and beneficiaries. And I'm sure that my colleagues can think of a couple of other ways to combat that consultation fatigue that very often happens. And the other obstacle that I reflect a lot on, having worked for funders and for organizations that provide grants, is thinking about how we think about those metrics and targets. And this is going back to what Paluck said about adaptability and flexibility. We've got oftentimes we'll have multiple food programs that we fund. Can we apply one metric or one target to a school breakfast program, to a shelter that feeds homeless individuals or people who are at risk of experiencing homelessness, to a program that is a cupboard for a community center? They all are serving very different populations or have very different circumstances of what food security looks like to them. So how do we create that adaptability? And I think that there's been a couple of different tools and resources, including the common approach to impact measurement, that have been addressed. And it goes back to just bringing in the participants to help develop that method, that approach, to really thinking about the uniqueness of those attributes. And I'm not going to continue on because my colleagues have already addressed those pieces, but I think that those are the two obstacles. And I think that there's so many great ways we can look at trying to turn them into opportunities.
Wow. So many incredible takeaways. I've been writing while I was kind of listening and hearing your thoughts, and this has been an incredible conversation. It's also the first step of the conversation, because there's a lot more to dissect in terms of intersectionalities and all those kind of pieces, rural versus urban, in the way that we're doing data collection. So I really want to take the time and thank you all for saying yes to this conversation. It was really critical for me to just kind of sit back and just absorb what everyone had to say, and listen, and in my own learnings as well, in the way that we're doing what we're supposed to and not supposed to be doing things. So thank you. And so it was wonderful to moderate and have the privilege of moderating this conversation. So I just want to thank each of you. And my hope, again, is that folks take the time to really dissect and audit their own practices in the way that things are being done, and are signing themselves up for accountability in the way that things are being done, and standing up to how things shouldn't be done. So that is my hope for after this conversation. So I just want to pause and thank each of you for that.